All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Um, the last year, I was looking at the problem of validating that there hasn't been some kind of illegal transition um, by looking at the problem topologically. So the idea is um, to check to see. You think of trend the com rule as providing a notion of continuity, and so if you look at the trajectory of a computation, it's not allowed to be discontinuous. That's essentially the idea, and this intuition goes all the way back to Dana Scott's models of the lambda calculus, which is to model in order to show that the lambda calculus is well founded, um, and you have this basic problem, which is that you've got a domain which is isomorphic to its function space, and you know that the cardinalities can't be equal unless you have some kind of constraint on the Hom object or the function space, and so Scott's insight was that you only look at the continuous functions, not all of the functions. So this idea of connecting computation to continuity is really much at the foundations of computing. Um, and so the thought is, um, if you if you look at um, a proposed state, if it lies outside of some kind of bounding box, or some kind of boundary that would be discontinuous, and that would be a way to detect that you've got an invalid transition. And then what you have to do is you have to come up with some kind of mapping to a um, of the computational states to something that is like a real or complex space, or some kind of um, some kind of topological space where you can look at continuity using arithmetic as opposed to using symbolic execution of the computation. So that's the challenge in that approach. And then more recently, I've been looking at um, the idea that you can take the characteristic formula of the last finalized state, and you can take the characteristic formula of the state that they propose that they're in, and you can check to see if last finalized state implies the state that they're in, or implies eventually the state that they're in. Um, and then and then the onus of that is that the model checking or the theorem proving there, you need to show that computation is smaller than the computation, than just simulating the computation, like just running it. So that's effectively the problem that we're trying to solve. Is we want to show that you can approximate, you can at least get that there's um, that you're in a valid state without having to simulate the entire computation. Um, and Over this past week, I've been thinking about the fact that the two ideas are actually related to one another. Um, so there's the idea of a formula actually maps onto the notion of a kind of an open set or a topological a topological predicate. Yeah. So the opens are correlated. The opens, which ultimately arise from some kind of subbasis. Those are your primitive operations, and you build up your primitive observations is what I meant, and then you build up your opens by combining the um, the primitive observations into more complicated observations. And this is exactly the same thing that you're doing with the logic. So the two ideas are in fact correlated to one another. And so the advantage of this is that um, you can look at converting either the computation or the formulae into some kind of some kind of topological space. Now, the reason I keep saying some kind of topological space is because typically um, uh, uh, the topological spaces associated with computation are, they don't have good separation properties. That was in fact the stumbling block or the interesting challenge for Dana Scott and his work. Like most topological spaces associated with computation are not even T1, let alone something like Hausdorff for T2, where you have what are called good separation properties. For those people who are not mathematicians, um, the T0, T1, T2 properties are all about being able to separate points using observations. T2 is sometimes called the booby space because you can, for any 2 points, you can find a pair of opens. So you can think of opens as effectively like disks or balls around the points, and the two opens will be disjoint, right? So you've got essentially two balls, and there and points inside them that are the 2 points that you're separating. So this is a really good a really nice separation property. And the generalization of this kind of niceness in terms of separation is called spatiality and sobriety. So you're interested in situation, like really tame situations are ones that are both spatial and sober. So I can never get which one is right without looking it up. Which one is which without looking it up. But essentially, the two properties are: do you have enough observations to separate the points, and do you have enough points to separate the observations? So that's the basic idea. And computational spaces are kind of tricky in this regard. They end up not giving you the best kind of separation properties in order to do these what are called quick checks. Um, so like you could run some kind of linear programming analysis on the space. But it turns out more recently, there's been some interesting work from Key Martin in deriving um, uh, uh, um, friendlier topological spaces for um, for looking at computational properties. So this is the line of research that I'm taking. It may seem kind of roundabout, but essentially what what I'm trying to do is to transform the problem of detecting whether or not you've got an invalid transition into a problem that looks like an arithmetic problem, like checking to see whether a point is inside a bounding box, because that turns out to be something that you can do relatively quickly, and that's what we're interested in. We want to be able to check in a reasonable time whether or not the state that a particular shard claims it's in could have been reached from the last state that we know was good without having to run the symbolic execution. And there are all kinds of dragons and problems like this, right? And like if you have too good a check, then you can solve the halting problem. So it can't be too easy. On the other hand, it's still reasonable that it not be so hard that you have to run the computation from the beginning of time. So that's essentially the nature of the puzzle I'm trying to solve. And what I was describing was a couple of different methods for going after the problem, and how the two methods are related and why they're both useful. I don't know if that made sense, but I'll stop there and check and see if anyone understood what I was
Yes,
saying.
I'm following. So let me ask a question. So so the situation where we have the current state being different from the final state, do we see that a high percentage of the what I guess how common will that be? Is this going to be a rare situation, or
No, that's the super common. So for example, you start off in Genesis block and someone runs a transaction, right?
okay?
And in that transaction, Alice gives some token to Bob, right? So the next state is different because
Oh,
token
okay,
transferred from Alice to Bob.
gotcha. So in that regard, it's so that the state's going to be constantly changing, and then so looking at what the final state it is, that transition, as you called it, if it's an invalid transition, this computation will be able to determine if that transition was invalid or not, or if it's
That
justified.
that's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the idea.
And
And like, it can't happen if you're running the Casper protocol, right? But the issue is that an entire shard could collude against all the other shards. So
mhm.
inside the shard, they all agree it's to our advantage economically if we lie about this transition, and that transition creates a double spend, right? And because they're inventing money out of nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then any shard that sort of makes a deal with this shard, they're getting money that came out of nowhere.
Okay. Okay.
So that's and right now the way we handle that is that there's a double-sided contract on either side, so that the two stakes are linked in a particular way. So you can you're at arm's length about this kind of stuff, but the arm's length relationship um, means that you can't get certain kinds of um, uh, computational efficiencies. So if the two shards could trust each other, so that they don't have to have this double-sided contract between them, then you can get a much better um, relationship. The transaction speeds end up being much faster. The total throughput of the network drops if you can increase the trust relationship between the shards. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The total throughput of the network increases if you can increase the trust relationship between the shards.
Right. And this mechanism that you're creating or outlining, this it'll have it'll be less resource intensive as opposed to having to go through and recalculate the whole state. Correct.
Yeah, yeah, and but the real bound we have to prove is that it's faster than the double-sided contract approach. And so that's where we have to. That's
Mm,
what I really have to hit with respect to the efficiency on making sure that the transitions are not invalid.
okay. And that term double-sided contract, I've been hearing that recently, and I have to admit I'm not familiar with what exactly that is.
So just think about you want to imagine that we wanted to stake between Ethereum and our chain. It's
Hmm.
double-sided in the sense that you have to have a smart contract on the Ethereum side and a smart contract on the
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I had a hunch it was something kind of along those lines, but thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, yeah. That's all we're doing is just making sure that there's a relationship between the two shards, a staking relationship between the two shards. That's all that's happening there. And we treat the shards as if they were completely different networks.
Okay. And and when I think about the roadmap, as far as this mechanism, so this would be so after Mercury moving something that would be more towards in Venus or perhaps after Venus.
So the sharding is like first on the Mercury backlog, right after Mercury is launched, and then we do sharding, and the first layer will just be this sort of plasma like two-sided contract thing. But
Okay.
if I can crack this thing fast enough, we
Hmm.
could get it in sooner.
Okay, so
Yeah.
as far as a safeguard, so we'll have the two-sided contract as that safety net for, provide the security, and this mechanism that you're discussing, this will be hopefully a substitute which will be more efficient,
Yeah.
and we can replace the two-sided contract. And whether it happens, you know, uh, yeah, and as far as the timeline, it's kind of loose at this point. Okay,
That's correct. That's exactly right. Yeah.
okay.
So we like last year we sketched out a pretty compelling model for the sharding, but it really depends upon this trust relationship between the shards that
Hmm.
we couldn't prove that was safe.
Hmm.
So we back down to this less efficient approach because we knew we could hit it within reasonable timelines.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good. All these discussions helps to create this picture. It's almost like a real roadmap in my mind as far as this timeline of everything working through the system. So all these discussions are very helpful in providing understanding clarity on my part. So
Oh,
thank you for
good,
that.
good. Well, no,
Yeah.
I appreciate your questions. Yeah, I mean, like there's this handful of us who've been going through this stuff and creating that roadmap for ourselves,
Hmm.
and it's difficult because there's all these technical things that are that the technical dependencies that create certain sequencing with respect to the roadmap, but
Hmm.
it's hard to share them because it requires understanding the technical dependencies, and that's what's slowly comes out through the Casper discussion and other kinds of discussions like this.
And it's helpful because I go back and because I'm engaged with other meetings like the governance meeting and now the DApp developers working group. So having
Mhm.
that framework, I can help to kind of you know educate the others or give sort of guidance, and it,
Mhm,
those discussions go better. So it's kind of, everything kind of filtering down through the system.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
So
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Great, great.
very good.
All right. I think I don't think Vlad's showing, so we can call it here, I guess.
Oh, sounds good. All right.
Awesome.
Well, thank you again, Greg. I appreciate the time, and I'm sure all the viewers during for the Casper stand-up will enjoy the discussion as well.
All right. Well, yeah, likewise. I really appreciate your time and your questions.
Very
Ciao for
good.
now.
Yep. Have a
All
good
right.
day. Bye now.
You too. Ciao.